When SES and I last met in person, it seems like forever, I presented a video essay in which I argued essentially that virtual reality or VR is a lousy medium for documentary storytelling, period. I've had occasion to rethink this position, and I've come to the conclusion that there may be one particular form of documentary storytelling to which VR is in fact exceptionally well suited. I'll explain, and toward the end of my talk, I'll give you a glimpse at an example. Before I launch into my explanation, I need to quickly tell you what I mean by VR and by documentary storytelling. There are basically two kinds of VR. One is made by filming an actual place or event with a 360-degree camera. So this allows the viewer to look around, which gives the sense of being in the middle of a place, right next to other people who may be there, even though one can't interact with them. The second kind of VR is made by creating a virtual 3D environment in a computer. This allows the viewer to move around and interact with objects and characters in a limited way. But because the scene is computer generated, it feels animated or game-like. When I use the term VR in this talk, I'm referring to both of these kinds of VR, unless I state otherwise. As for documentary storytelling, not all documentaries tell stories expressly, but many do. And those that do expressly tell stories very often do so for the purpose of helping viewers understand and relate to the social and mental experiences of their human subjects. I'm using the term documentary storytelling as a kind of shorthand to refer to that type of documentary. A premise of this talk is that even though VR is terrific for simulating or creating many kinds of experience, like swimming with sharks, being in the middle of a political rally, playing first-person shooter games, and so on, one thing that VR is definitely not good for is the kind of documentary storytelling I just described. As a case in point, I'll refer to a pioneering 2015 VR documentary, Clouds Over Sidra, about a 12-year-old Syrian girl living in a refugee camp in Jordan. The purpose of that documentary, according to the filmmaker, is to help us empathize with the refugee girl. I maintain that the piece doesn't do very well in achieving that goal, mainly because instead of focusing our attention on the girl and her experience, the VR constantly invites us to look around, to focus on our own experience. The problem isn't that the movie is badly made. The problem is the medium. VR is simply not as effective as cinema in helping us to understand the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of other people. That's the basic argument I made in my video essay 2 years ago. When the video essay was published last year, new media scholar Miriam Ross raised a very interesting objection. In conceiving storytelling in cinematic terms, as I do, Ross argued, I conceived it too narrowly. There isn't just one kind of documentary storytelling, she implies. There are many. VR documentaries, including Clouds Over Sidra, don't aim to tell cinematic stories using different means. They're exploring new forms of storytelling, and in so doing, they may be helping us to expand our very idea of what documentary stories and storytelling mean. Now, my big difference with Ross, or her difference with me, doesn't really have anything to do with VR, I think. It has to do with our conception of stories and storytelling. Ross seems to have a very expansive view. Whatever it is that VR happens to be used for, whether it's playing video games or simulating the experience of swimming with sharks or whatever, Ross seems to regard that as a form of storytelling. My conception of stories and storytelling is more specific. But even if I accept Ross's expansive definition, that doesn't address my fundamental criticism of VR as a medium for documentary, which is that instead of focusing our attention on the mental and social lives of other people in the way that movies typically do, it almost inevitably draws our attention toward our own experience, much like video games. So, what's wrong with that? If the purpose of a VR experience is play, to imagine piloting a spaceship or fighting off zombie attackers, for example, there's nothing at all wrong with it. If the purpose of a VR experience is to be evocative, like a poem, or to prompt an aesthetic response, like a dance, focusing on our own experience may be just great. But what's the purpose of virtually visiting a Syrian refugee camp? Is it to play a game, to explore, to have a stimulating aesthetic experience? Or is it to help us understand the social and emotional experiences of the people who are forced to live there, like that refugee girl? That's the purpose of Clouds Over Sidra, according to its producer. And that's the purpose I think the piece ought to have, given its topic. Unfortunately, because it was made in VR, it's just not terribly effective in achieving this goal. Still, Ross's objection raises a very interesting question. Might there be some other goal of documentary storytelling that's worthwhile in a different way and that's better suited to VR than to conventional cinema? That's a question I admit I hadn't thought about, and to think about that now is the purpose of this paper. In order to explain what's distinctive about VR, I want to talk for a moment about conventional cinematic storytelling, since that's something we're all very familiar with. One of the things that makes cinematic storytelling so engaging and worthwhile is how effective it can be at allowing us to imaginatively engage with the lives and experiences of characters. It can be so effective at this, in fact, that we tend to forget about ourselves while we watch. Some media psychologists refer to this phenomenon as narrative transportation. Mainstream movies accomplish this effect by foregrounding characters' problems, desires, and emotions. Extraneous or background elements like visual effects and music largely serve to shape or reinforce our understanding of what characters are thinking and feeling. All of our attention and imagination is focused on the events we see unfolding on the screen, and in particular, on the impact those events have on characters. Even though we may wind up identifying with those characters, we're just observers. Even though we may project our own feelings on the characters and compare our own experiences to theirs, the story we are experiencing is always their story, not ours. For that reason, we can think of this as third-person storytelling. This is admittedly an oversimple description of the way movies work, especially documentaries, as I'll explain later. But I think it gets to the heart of what makes escapist Hollywood movies so popular. Video games can induce a state of absorption similar to narrative transportation. Game theorists refer to this as flow. But what puts you in a state is not a focus on the problems, desires, and emotions of characters, as with movies. It's on dealing with the challenges of the game. Even though in many video games, the experience involves taking on the role and even the body of a virtual character. And even though your character's task is typically depicted in social terms, like making money or vanquishing enemies, what puts you in that state of flow is not imagining what characters in the game may be thinking or feeling. It's mastering the skills you need to advance to the next level. Even in the case of a video game like The Last of Us, which is famous for making players cry on account of its bittersweet narrative ending, the feeling of sadness is mostly relevant as part of the player's experience. The player's experience is the primary focus. For that reason, we can think of this as first-person storytelling. This description of video gameplay is, again, oversimple. In fact, the emotionally moving scenes in The Last of Us and similar games are cinematic cutscenes in which the player is a mere observer and has no control. Third person scenes, in other words. First person applies mainly to gameplay sequences. In The Last of Us, the gameplay sequences revolve around the relatively simple and repetitive actions of avoiding and dispatching zombie-like creatures and human enemies. These actions are the heart of the gameplay experience and are what put gamers into that state of flow. They are very obviously a long way from imagining the thoughts and feelings of other people. Although I'm using the terms first and third person in a somewhat idiosyncratic way here to refer to two different kinds of experience rather than two different kinds of narration, there's nothing especially novel or controversial about the difference I'm describing between the experience of movies and the experience of video games. But there's a fascinating social dimension to this difference that's not often discussed. When you watch a movie, because what matters is somebody else's experience, you're generally supposed to silence your cell phone, shut your mouth, and pay attention. If you feel a social or emotional connection to somebody during a movie, it's most likely to a person on screen. Video games are very different in this regard, as is especially apparent from online games like Fortnite. Because the focus of video gameplay is your own experience, you're more than welcome to share it. Through such sharing, my experience often becomes our experience, still first person, but first person plural. This can create the feeling of a social and emotional connection to other players, especially those on your team. The downside is that other characters, including folks on the other team, can be effectively reduced to incidental props or opponents to be beaten. So, if your goal is to use stories to foster caring or compassion for others, as documentaries are often supposed to do, the difference between what I'm referring to as first person and third person storytelling clearly has important ramifications. I observed earlier that, like video games, VR stories constantly prompt you to attend to your own experience. But with VR documentaries like Clouds over Sidra, something more complicated is going on. The stories they tell aren't just experienced in third person in the way of entertainment films, and not just in first person, as with video gameplay. They have a second person quality. In second person discourse, you have a sense of being in a direct relationship with someone. When somebody writes you a letter, asks you to pass the salt, or likes one of your Facebook posts, that's second person discourse. In VR documentaries like Clouds over Sidra, you have a sense of being in the same space as subjects, even though you can't interact with them. This effect is especially pronounced when they look or speak directly to you, or to the camera, actually, something that rarely happens in fiction films precisely because it disrupts the transparency of third person storytelling. Our attention in these moments is subtly drawn to our relationship with the subject. Some of the most compelling experiments in VR fiction make deliberate use of this second person effect. An excellent example is Wolves in the Walls, which won an Emmy in 2019 for Outstanding Innovation. The story, based on a children's book by Neil Gaiman, is about a little girl who hears scratching in the walls and, because nobody believes her, sets out to prove that something is really there. What's most fascinating and engaging about the way the story is told is not the feeling of being there in VR. It's the way the girl constantly interacts with you. She looks directly at you when she talks, and her eyes follow you when you move about. If you try to duck or dodge out of her line of sight, she asks, "What are you doing?" She hands you things like a virtual camera and invites you to do things with her, like draw on the wall. When you observe something in third person mode, like the girl's dad playing the cello, the girl is by your side, looking with you and talking to you. This isn't a video game where the focus is on your own choices. The focus most of the time is on the girl and her interests and experiences. But you aren't just an observer either. Instead, you're part of the story as the girl's friend and confidant. As it happens, there's a form of conventional cinema that also makes very heavy use of second person storytelling: documentary. Conventional cinematic documentaries are full of explicit second person discourse, like interviews and voiceover narration. There's also an implicit sense in which documentaries are second person discourses in their entirety, like allegorical fables and newspaper editorials and thesis novels. We know they're supposed to have a message or point. They're trying to tell us something. This suggests that there may be a natural affinity between VR as a medium and documentary storytelling having to do with second person address. It also suggests that, in spite of the shortcomings of VR as a means of understanding what is going on in characters or subjects' heads, VR may have compensatory advantages for documentary storytelling, having to do with the sense it can give of being in a relationship to other people. I need to clarify something here. I've been discussing third, first, and second person experiences as though they're separate and discrete. In fact, they're regularly intermingled in fiction films, video games, documentaries, and VR experiences. So it might be best to think of them as the center of narrative gravity of moments or scenes. Center of narrative gravity is actually a term philosopher Daniel Dennett coined to describe his conception of the self and consciousness. I use the term here because I find it quite helpful to think about the three modes of narrative experience as three different modes of self-consciousness. Our creative imagination can focus on three different things when we think about social situations: our own subjective experience, first person, our understanding of the experiences of others, third person, or our relationship with someone else, second person. We can only really focus on one of these at a time because of the limits of attention. Nevertheless, when watching VR documentaries, we experience a kind of tension between these perspectives and switch back and forth between them. Usually, the implicit purpose of a documentary and the explicit second person address in a documentary are closely aligned. For example, in March of the Penguins, Morgan Freeman's sonorous narration, the film's awesome aerial shots, and its personification of penguins all fit perfectly with the movie's primary aim as a documentary, which is to foster appreciation of nature. Even though the techniques work to draw us into the story, they're also constant subtle reminders of the overarching purpose of the story. This isn't just a regular entertainment film, they say. It's important, since it's about the life and death struggle of actual penguins. In the documentaries of Michael Moore, the alignment is even more direct. Since Moore is the main character in his films, as well as the filmmaker, he more or less tells us outright what we're supposed to think, whether we happen to agree with him or not. In VR documentaries like Clouds Over Sidra, in contrast, there's a subtle misalignment between the way the movie speaks to us and its purpose. The movie's supposed to create empathy with its subject, the Syrian refugee girl. It does succeed in giving us a vivid and visceral sense of her physical situation. The living room of her family's tiny apartment, her schoolyard surrounded by a barbed wire fence, and so on. But as I've said, it tends to distract us from the girl itself. The effect is to prompt us to think or feel, how would I like to live in a place like that? Or sometimes, I wonder what I will see if I turn around. On the other hand, there's something undeniably compelling about the girl sitting across from you in VR and speaking to you directly. The feeling of being there in the same space as the girl gives her address to you a kind of immediacy and force. The perpetual temptation in VR to gawk around, to see what's behind you or off to the side, is modified by a subtle emotional pressure to pay attention to the girl, prompted by the sense of her presence, a word that's very commonly used in discussions of VR. Consider the social ramifications of this kind of address compared to those of movies and video games. The transparent third-person address of mainstream fiction films creates an imaginary connection to characters in the movies. You put yourself in their shoes, so to speak. That's the power and the appeal of that kind of storytelling. The first-person address of video game storytelling invites you to focus on your own experience. That's its power and appeal. But you can also share your experience with others, which creates the feeling of a social bond or connection. Second-person discourse has a similar effect of creating the feeling of being in a relationship with someone. What's special about the second-person addresses in VR stories is the sense of being with somebody else as a companion or associate or confidant. This creates a subtle feeling of obligation toward the person speaking to you. You could look away because this is VR, but perhaps you shouldn't. So, if VR has some special strength for documentary storytelling, perhaps it lies in its capacity to virtually put you in the presence of other people who can speak to you directly. VR is not nearly as good as conventional cinema for creating understanding of others, but perhaps in some cases it can compensate for or even overcome that weakness by facilitating a sense of social connection with and obligation toward its on-screen subjects. Unfortunately, in Clouds Over Sidra, this effect is quite transitory. It vanishes the moment the little girl is off-screen, addressing us in voiceover. It lacks the capacity to hold our attention in the way a good story does. It's also continually undercut by the invitation to look around, as I've pointed out. All of these shortcomings are related to the fact that Clouds Over Sidra is trying to relate a pretty conventional linear story. But what if a VR documentary were to abandon the goal of quasi-cinematic storytelling altogether and instead use the game-like qualities of interactive VR to try to create a sense of social connection with documentary subjects in something akin to the way Wolves of the Walls does with its fictional protagonist? There's actually a documentary that does this, the 2020 interactive animated documentary The Book of Distance by artist and filmmaker Randall Okita.
Grandfather was the
The subject of the
quietest man
piece is
I've
the
ever
artist
known.
himself,
He never
as he
spoke
tries
about
to
his
imagine the
past or
experiences of
his
his
life in
Japanese
Japan before he came
grandfather,
to
who
Canada.
immigrated to Canada just
He
before
never
World
spoke
War
Japanese
II.
to me.
These imaginings are presented in animated vignettes, some of which include family photographs and other historical artifacts that the viewer can interact with. The effect is to engage viewers in the artist's personal quest to make sense of his family's history. The question is, might this have been achieved more effectively with conventional cinematic means? The VR medium provides an interesting, pretty engaging first-person experience, but does it ultimately bring us any deeper understanding of or genuine caring for Okita and his grandfather? Or does it mainly make us feel satisfied for self-centered reasons, like a video game? This question calls to mind a 2017 essay in The Atlantic by video game theorist Ian Bogosian entitled "Video Games Are Better Without Stories." In this essay, Bogosian discusses the video game What Remains of Edith Finch. The mechanics of that game are similar to the mechanics of the Book of Distance. You, the player, are Edith Finch, the last survivor from a cursed family exploring a vacant house you inherited from your deceased mother. As you explore, two things happen. First, as in the Book of Distance, you gradually uncover stories about your doomed ancestors through diaries, recordings, and mementos. Second, unlike the Book of Distance, you encounter weird new spaces in the house and experience weird altered states, like taking on the form of animals. Bogosian muses, why does this story need to be told as a video game? The whole way through, he says, I found myself wondering why I couldn't experience Edith Finch as a traditional time-based narrative. Bogosian's answer, essentially, is that because then he wouldn't have had all those weird and wonderful aesthetic experiences. In other words, the game's story succeeds because it abandons the whole idea of third-person storytelling. It's not really a story about a person named Edith Finch. It's really about you, the player. And that's good, Bogosian seems to conclude, because what remains of Edith Finch is, after all, a game. But what if Edith Finch's ancestors were real people with real pasts and real stories? In that case, treating her past as something to explore and experience game-wise might be giving short shrift to those people's actual lives and experiences. What saves me from such misgivings with respect to the Book of Distance is that the real subject of the documentary is the artist himself. He speaks to us directly in his own voice throughout the experience. So even in the midst of our own explorations and experiences, we have a sense of partnering with him. Could more or less the same experience have been achieved with conventional cinematic means? Yes and no. A linear narrative would have resulted in a more directed, more focused, possibly even more moving account of Okina's grandfather's experiences. On the other hand, a linear narrative would have sacrificed the sense of partnering with the artist in a personal exploration of his family's history. From a documentary storytelling perspective, there's definitely something engaging, worthwhile, even advantageous about that sense of a social connection to the author of the piece, which results from the interactivity of the VR medium. Notice, however, that the Book of Distance doesn't ask us to identify with Okina or his grandfather, or to empathize with them, or to be transported into their lives and experiences. The piece just doesn't work that way. Instead, it invites us to remember Okina's grandfather and to reflect on events in his life by experiencing his grandson's artistic reimaginings of them. If the goal of a documentary is to provide a kind of transparent window into the life, thoughts, and feelings of another person, like, for example, a Syrian girl living in a refugee camp, then I still maintain that the interactivity of a piece like this, or even the ability to look around in a 360-degree VR experience, actually gets in the way.